The smell of burnt oil permeated every corner of St. George's Garage, in the Hopewood district of Manchester. Robert Smith wiped his calloused hands on a worn rag as he watched the brilliant yellow Camaro pull into the workshop. The roar of the V8 engine echoed off the grease-stained walls, heralding the arrival of another difficult day. Graham Sterling Jr. stepped out of the car with the posture of someone who had never had to bow to anyone. Imported sunglasses, a watch that cost more than 3 years of Robert's salary, Italian shoes that reflected the dim light of the fluorescent bulbs. He was in his early 30s with hair impeccably slicked back, and that smile Robert had learned to recognize, the smile of someone who thought the whole world was for sale. "Morning, Mr. Sterling," Robert greeted, swallowing the pride that still insisted on making itself known even after so many years. "Brought it in for the 15,000-mile service?" Graham didn't even look at him directly. His eyes scanned the garage with obvious disdain, as if assessing how long he could stand to breathe the air. "Yeah, if you can even call it a service. Last time you took 3 days for something any decent garage would do in one." "Mr. Sterling, the problem was more complex than it seemed. The head gasket—" Robert began to explain, but was cut off. "Spare me the technical details, mechanic. I just want the car ready by tomorrow. I have an important event this weekend and I can't show up in anything else." Graham tossed the keys onto the workbench, nearly hitting Robert's hand. "And this time, try not to get grease on the leather upholstery with those filthy hands of yours." Robert felt the blood rush to his head, but he took a deep breath. He couldn't afford to lose this client, no matter how unbearable he was. Mr. Davies, the owner of the garage, had been clear at the last meeting. They needed to keep every client who paid on time, especially those who brought in expensive cars. Times were tough for everyone. "You can count on it, sir. I'll handle the job personally," Robert replied, his voice firm but without inflection. "Oh, really?" Graham finally looked at him, taking off his sunglasses. "And you think that reassures me? A middle-aged mechanic looking after my imported Camaro. Robert, is that your name? Do you have any idea how much this car costs?" Robert knew every bolt, every technical specification of that Camaro. He knew because he had driven infinitely more complex cars, had tuned engines that developed twice the horsepower, had felt the adrenaline of overtaking on the perfect corner at over 150 miles per hour. But that was another life, a past he had buried along with his dreams. "I imagine it's very valuable, sir," was all he said. "Very valuable?" Graham laughed, an unpleasant sound that echoed through the garage. "This car cost £100,000. 100,000. That's probably more than you'll make in your entire life, isn't it? And here you are with those old shaky hands, telling me you're going to take care of it." Robert's hands didn't shake from age. They shook because he hadn't slept properly in weeks. They shook because every night he spent at the hospital, sitting beside the bed of Isabella, his 12-year-old daughter, watching her small body fight against something invisible and relentless. They shook because the doctors had said that conventional treatment wasn't enough, that there was a new therapy with imported drugs that could increase her chances of recovery by 30%, but that it cost £20,000, an impossible sum for a 50-year-old mechanic. "I'll do the best job possible, Mr. Sterling," Robert replied, looking away. Joe Carter, one of the younger mechanics in the garage, witnessed the whole scene from a distance. He had known Robert for 5 years and had never seen him so restrained, so willing to swallow insults. He approached after Graham left, calling for a private driver who was waiting outside. "Rob, you didn't have to take that," Joe said, placing a hand on his friend's shoulder. "I need the job, Joe, you know that." "But that guy is a—" "I know what he is." Robert pulled out the work order and started writing. "But Bella needs me working, not unemployed because of my pride." Joe nodded in understanding. Everyone at the garage knew about Isabella's situation. In the last 2 months since she had been admitted to the hospital, Robert had become a shadow of his former self. He worked on autopilot, performing each task with mechanical perfection, but with no life in his eyes. During breaks, they saw him constantly checking his phone, waiting for news from the hospital. "How is she?" Joe asked. "Stable." Robert didn't look up from the clipboard. "The doctors say she's responding to the treatment, but it's slow, very slow. And they mentioned that new medicine again, that immunotherapy. They say it could make a real difference. And the insurance doesn't cover it. Robert let out a humorless laugh. The NHS covers the basics. The rest is considered experimental. £20,000, Joe. 20,000. I'd have to work for 3 years without spending a single penny to save that up. Paul, the other mechanic, approached holding a coffee. He had overheard the last part of the conversation. Mate, we could start a fundraiser, organize something. There are those platforms online. Robert shook his head. I appreciate it, Paul, I really do. But I can't just wait for charity from others while time is running out. I need a real solution, a fast one. Mr. Davies came out of his small office in the back, cleaning his glasses on his shirt. He had witnessed Robert's humiliation through the frosted glass window. He was a man of 60, owner of the garage for 35 years, and he felt a mixture of shame and helplessness. He knew he needed to keep clients like Graham Sterling to pay the bills, but it hurt to see a dedicated employee like Robert treated that way. Robert, can I have a word with you for a minute? Mr. Davies called. They went into the cramped office, which smelled of old paper and stale coffee. Mr. Davies closed the door and sighed heavily before speaking. Look, I saw what happened out there, and I'm sorry, truly sorry. If I could tell that rich brat to go to hell, I would, but I know, Mr. Davies, you don't have to explain. Robert sat down in the plastic chair. I understand the situation. It's just, his father, Sterling Sr., owns 3 dealerships in the region. He sends a lot of work our way, cars from wealthy clients who trust his name. If I lose the son's account, I lose the father's referrals, and then— Mr. Davies didn't need to finish. I can handle it, Mr. Davies. I've handled worse in my life. The garage owner looked at Robert with curiosity. There was something about the man he had never been able to fully decipher. A quiet, dignity, a posture that didn't match the resignation of someone who had always been a neighborhood mechanic. Sometimes, when Robert worked on a more complex engine, Mr. Davies saw in his eyes an expertise that went beyond common technical knowledge. Robert, you've never told me much about your past. Before you came to work here, what did you do? Robert hesitated. It was a question he had been avoiding for years. I worked with cars. In another place, another life. I see. Mr. Davies didn't press. Everyone has their ghosts, don't they? But I want you to know that I value your work here. You're the best mechanic I have, and that's not flattery. Thank you, Mr. Davies. And about Isabella, if there's anything I can do, anything at all, you're already doing it by keeping me employed. Robert stood up. I'm going to start on the Camaro now. It'll be ready tomorrow, just like he wants. When Robert returned to the workshop floor, he saw Joe and Paul talking in low voices. They fell silent when they noticed him, but Robert caught the end of the conversation. That amateur race at the municipal racetrack next Sunday, £5,000. Prize money for first place, £5,000. A quarter of what he needed, but it would be a start. Robert pretended not to have heard and went over to the yellow Camaro, opening the bonnet carefully. The gleaming V8 engine stared back at him, a heart of iron and fire that pulsed with power. He ran his fingers over the chrome parts, feeling the cold texture of the metal. For a moment, he allowed himself to remember the smell of racing fuel, the deafening roar of engines at the start, the feeling of absolute control when entering, a corner at the limit of adhesion. To remember when his name, Robert Smith, was spoken with respect in the paddocks, when sponsors fought for space on his racing suit, when every victory was celebrated with champagne on the podium. But remembering also brought the other memory. Turn 3, that damn turn 3. The car ahead losing oil, his right rear wheel hitting the slick patch, the touch of the barrier, the bonnet flying up, the impact, and then the fire. The fire that consumed the car, that burned his skin, that left scars not just on his body but on his soul. 8 months in the hospital, dozens of surgeries, and worst of all, the fear. The fear that settled so deep that, even years later, he couldn't push a car beyond a certain speed without feeling his hands sweat and his heart race. Robert shook his head, pushing the memories away. That was the past. Now he was just a mechanic trying to save his daughter. He began to work on the Camaro, each movement precise and efficient, the fruit of decades of experience. As he checked the levels, changed the oil, inspected the brake pads, his mind returned to the conversation he had overheard. An amateur race, £5,000 prize money. Could he still do it? No, he thought immediately. He wasn't that man anymore. The trauma, the fear, had stolen from him the one thing he truly knew how to do. But £5,000, it was a start, and Isabella needed that start. Night had fallen over Manchester when Robert finally finished the job on the Camaro. It was almost 10 o'clock, and the garage was empty except for him. Mr. Davies had left hours ago, as had Joe and Paul. Only Robert remained, illuminated by the yellowish light of a single bulb over the workbench. He wiped his hands one last time, put away his tools with his usual meticulous care, and picked up his phone. 4 unread messages from Carmen, the nurse who looked after Isabella on the night shift. Robert's heart pounded, as it always did when he saw notifications from the hospital. With trembling fingers, he opened the messages. "Mr. Smith, Bella is fine. Just asked about you. She ate her dinner well tonight, almost all the mashed potatoes. She's sleeping now. No need to come if you're tired. But if you do, she'd love to see you when she wakes up." Robert sighed, relieved and guilty at the same time. Guilty because he had missed another evening by his daughter's side, a few more precious hours that would never come back. But he had to work, had to keep his job, had to have money to at least pay for the basic treatment while he couldn't get the $20,000 for the special therapy. He locked up the garage and walked to his car, a moss-green 1987 Vauxhall Chevette parked out back. It was the only valuable possession he owned, inherited from his father Arnold, who had passed away 10 years earlier. The car was far from pretty. It had dents, the paint was peeling in places, the upholstery was worn. But the engine, the engine was another story. Robert had spent years rebuilding that engine with his own hands. Every part had been chosen, tuned, and calibrated with surgical precision. He knew every sound that engine made, every vibration, every response of the accelerator. It was the only personal project he maintained, the only connection he still had with who he truly was. He got into the car and started the engine. The deep, even rumble filled the silence of the night. Robert closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the vibration in the steering wheel, listening to the mechanical symphony that only he seemed to fully understand. Then he put the car in gear and headed for St. Monica's Hospital. St. Monica's Hospital was 20 minutes from the garage, a 7-story building that Robert had come to know intimately over the last 2 months. He knew which lift was fastest, which corridor was quietest, where the best working coffee machine was. He knew the faces of the night security guards, the nurses, the doctors on call. That place had become his second home, or perhaps his first, because it was where the most important thing in the world was. Isabella was on the 4th floor, the pediatric oncology ward. Robert took the stairs, as he always did, needing to feel the physical exhaustion to keep from overthinking. When he reached the corridor, he saw through the ajar door that the light in her room was on. Isabella was awake. "Dad." Her voice was weak but cheerful. "I knew you'd come." Robert went in and sat on the chair beside the bed, taking his daughter's small, cold hand. "Bella, my love, Carmen said you ate well tonight. I'm so proud." Isabella smiled. She was thinner, paler. The brown hair she loved so much had almost completely fallen out due to chemotherapy. But her eyes, those green eyes just like her mother's, still shone with life and determination. "Dr. Evans came by today. He said my tests are better," Isabella recounted, excited. "He said I'm responding well, that soon I'll be able to go home." Robert smiled but felt a tightness in his chest. He had spoken with Dr. Evans that morning. Yes, Isabella was responding to the treatment, but not as quickly as they had hoped. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia was treacherous, and every day mattered. The immunotherapy with the imported drugs could significantly speed up the process, could give this 12-year-old girl a real chance at a full life, but it cost the equivalent of a small car, an absurd and inaccessible amount. "You'll be home soon, yes, and we'll do everything you want. We'll go to the park, to the cinema, we'll get that pizza you love. And you'll take me for a drive in the Chevette?" Isabella asked, with that mischievous look Robert knew so well. Of course I will. We'll take a spin around the whole neighborhood. Isabella was silent for a moment, looking at her father with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. Dad, you look so tired. You have dark circles under your eyes. I'm fine, sweetheart. Just working a bit more, that's all. It's because of the expensive medicine, isn't it? Isabella said softly. I heard the nurse talking to the doctor about that treatment that costs a lot of money. Robert felt his world crumble. Bella, you don't need to worry about that. But I do worry, Dad. I don't want you to suffer because of me. If we can't afford it, I'll be fine anyway. The doctor said the normal treatment works too. Tears stung Robert's eyes, but he held them back. He couldn't cry in front of his daughter. He had to be strong, had to be her rock. Isabella, I'm going to get that money. You don't have to worry, okay? You just need to focus on getting better, on being strong. I am strong, Dad. Isabella squeezed his hand. I learned from you. You've always been the strongest man I know. Robert almost lost his composure. If only she knew the truth. If she knew her father was a coward who couldn't push a car anymore because of fear. If she knew he had abandoned everything he loved because he didn't have the courage to face the trauma. If she knew that he was now considering entering an amateur race precisely because he was desperate. Bella, do you remember when I told you about my past? About what I did before I was a mechanic? Isabella nodded, her eyes shining. You were a race car driver. In the touring car championship. You showed me those old photos, the trophies, the fast cars. You were famous, Dad. Not that famous, Robert smiled, but I loved it. I loved it a lot. It was all I knew how to do. Why did you stop? You never really told me. Isabella pulled the blanket up, feeling cold despite the heater being on. Robert hesitated. He had never told his daughter about the accident, about the burns, about the months in the hospital, about the trauma that left him unable to return to the track. She was too young at the time, only 3 years old, and he had decided to spare her those terrible details. I had an accident, Bella. A bad one. I got hurt, had to stay in the hospital for a long time. And when I got out, I realized I couldn't do it anymore. The fear was stronger than the will. But did you miss it? Every day. Robert looked at the window, seeing his reflection in the dark glass. Every single day of my life. But sometimes you have to let go of who you are for bigger things. When you were born, I had to be a father, I had to be responsible. Racing is dangerous, it's uncertain. I became a mechanic so I could raise you properly. And Mum? Isabella asked quietly. Did she leave because of the accident? Robert swallowed hard. His ex-wife, Maria, had left his life 15 years ago, right after the accident. She couldn't stand to see him broken, without money, without prospects. She had left Isabella, still a baby, with him and simply disappeared. She started a new family in another county and never got in touch again. Your mother followed her own path, Bella. Don't hold a grudge. Everyone makes their own choices. I think she missed out on a lot, Isabella said, with the surprising wisdom of a child facing her own mortality. She missed the chance to know the best dad in the world. Robert couldn't hold back the tears any longer. He stood up, kissed his daughter's forehead, and hugged her carefully, feeling her fragile body in his arms. I love you more than anything in this world, Bella. And I'll do whatever it takes to make you well, whatever it takes. Isabella fell asleep shortly after, and Robert watched her for another hour before leaving the hospital. It was almost midnight when he arrived at the small 2-bedroom flat where they lived, in the Parkside district. The place was simple, modest, but it was theirs. Photos of Isabella covered the walls, her drawings from when she was little, school reports, memories of a life that seemed to have stopped 2 months ago. Robert couldn't sleep. He sat at the kitchen table, an old notebook in front of him, doing the maths. He added and subtracted, calculated and recalculated, but the numbers never added up. On his mechanic's salary, even saving, absolutely everything, it would take years to save £20,000, and Isabella didn't have years. She had now, the next few months, maybe weeks. He picked up his phone and searched for information about the amateur race. It was an annual event organized by the city council at the municipal racetrack on the north side of the city. Anyone could enter, as long as they had a minimally prepared car and paid the £100 entry fee. First place took £5,000, second took £2,500, third took £1,000. £5,000, a quarter of what he needed, but it would be a start. And if he could find more races, more prizes, maybe in 3 or 4 months he could raise enough. Of course, that meant getting back behind the wheel, pushing the throttle, facing the fear that had paralyzed him for 15 years. Robert looked at his hands. They weren't shaking anymore. They were firm, calloused, strong. They were hands that had held steering wheels at impossible speeds, that had felt every vibration of the track through the leather, that had executed overtakes other drivers considered suicidal. Was there anything left of that man inside him? Did Robert Smith, the driver, still exist somewhere buried under layers of fear and resignation? He opened a drawer and took out an old shoebox. Inside, he kept newspaper clippings, faded photos, small trophies. It was his past, his forgotten glory. He ran his fingers over a photo of himself on the podium, his racing suit stained with champagne, smiling with that unshakable confidence he no longer remembered having. The next day was Friday, and Robert arrived at the garage determined to sign up for the race. But before he could do anything, he saw the yellow Camaro parked in front of the door. Graham Sterling Jr. had arrived early to pick up his car. Graham entered the garage with the same arrogance as the day before, but this time he had company. 2 equally well-dressed friends accompanied him, laughing at something he had said. The 3 of them stopped when they saw the Camaro, perfectly clean and gleaming under the morning light. "Well, let's see if you've at least done the job right this time," Graham said, walking around the car like a judge inspecting a defendant. Robert, Paul and Joe watched in silence. Graham opened the bonnet, looked at the engine without really understanding what he was seeing, and slammed it shut with excessive force. He started the car, revved it a few times, listening to the roar of the V8, and finally turned it off. "Seems you haven't broken anything, at least." "We did everything as requested, Mr. Sterling," Robert said, handing him the invoice. "Changed the oil, filters, checked the brake system, aligned and balanced." Graham took the invoice and grimaced at the total. £300 for a simple service? You're robbing me." Mr. Davies came out of his office, adjusting his glasses. "Mr. Sterling, the price is standard for this model. Original parts are expensive, as you know." "Expensive is relative, Mr. Davies. For you, perhaps it's a lot. For me, it barely covers dinner tonight." Graham signed the receipt with disdain. "But fine, I'll consider it charity. After all, you people need to survive too, don't you?" It was then that one of Graham's friends noticed Robert's Chevette parked out back. The faded moss-green bodywork, the dents, the general appearance of a vehicle that should be in a scrapyard. "Graham, look at that," the friend pointed, laughing. "Is someone seriously still driving a wreck like that?" Graham turned, and his eyes glinted with malice when he saw the car. "Whose banger is that? Don't tell me one of you actually drives it?" Robert felt his blood boil, but before he could answer, Joe stepped in. "It's Rob's. It's an '87 Chevette, a classic." "A classic?" Graham roared with laughter. "That's scrap metal on wheels. How can you have the nerve to drive something like that, Robert? Aren't you embarrassed?" "It's an honest car," Robert replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "It gets me where I need to go." Graham walked over to the Chevette, his friends following like hyenas trailing a lion. They circled the car, examining every flaw, every imperfection, making derogatory comments. Robert clenched his fists, but Mr. Davies placed a hand on his shoulder, silently asking him to control himself. "You know what's funny?" Graham said, leaning pointedly on the Chevette's bonnet. "I spend more on washing my Camaro than this entire heap is worth. How much do you think you could get for it? 500, 1,000? "It's not for sale," Robert said sharply. "Of course it's not. Who would buy it?" Graham opened the Chevette's bonnet without asking. The 3 of them looked at the engine, and suddenly the mood changed. "Hang on," said one of Graham's friends, who apparently knew a bit about cars. "This engine's been tuned. Look at these parts. This isn't standard." Graham leaned in for a better look. His eyes scanned the meticulously rebuilt engine, the chrome parts, the modified intake manifold, the sports camshaft. Indeed, this was no ordinary Chevette engine. "Robert, did you work on this engine?" Graham asked, his tone different, almost respectful. "Yes," Robert replied. I rebuilt it from scratch. Every part was chosen and tuned by me. And does it run? Does it have real power, or is it just for show? It runs, and it has enough power. Graham closed the bonnet and stared at Robert for a long moment. There was something in the mechanic's eyes, a confidence he hadn't noticed before. You know, Robert, you surprise me. A middle-aged mechanic with a tuned-up toy car. Tell me, do you race this thing? I used to, Robert answered before he could think. Used to? What do you mean, used to? A long time ago. Another life. Paul, who had been listening to everything, couldn't hold back. He was a driver in the Touring Car Championship, a professional, for 12 years. The silence that followed was heavy. Graham looked at Robert in disbelief, then burst out laughing. You? A touring car driver? Don't make me laugh. It's true, Mr. Davies confirmed, to everyone's surprise. I didn't know at first, but I found out a few years ago. Robert was a champion in a few seasons, had sponsors, a team, everything. He was one of the greats. Graham stopped laughing, but the mocking smile remained. So let me get this straight. You were a professional driver, and now you're a neighborhood mechanic. What happened? Did you drink all the money away? Gambled and lost? I had an accident, Robert said, his voice tense. A serious one. I was out for a long time. When I came back, I couldn't do it anymore. Simple as that. Trauma? One of Graham's friends asked with false sympathy. How sad. A driver who's afraid to drive. Robert didn't answer. His hands were shaking now, not from fear, but from contained rage. Joe and Paul exchanged worried glances. Graham walked around the Chevette one more time, thoughtful. So an ex-professional driver with a tuned Chevette. Interesting. Tell me, Robert, if you're not afraid anymore, would you prove it? I have nothing to prove to you, sir, Robert replied. Oh, but I think you do. Graham pulled out his wallet. I'm heading to the municipal racetrack tomorrow for some practice laps. Why don't you show up with your little car? Let's see if that tuned engine is good for anything besides decorating the garage. I'm not interested, Robert said, turning to go back to work. It was then that Paul, meaning to help, let slip the fatal piece of information. Rob's racing next Sunday in the amateur race. He's going for the prize money. Robert closed his eyes, knowing he had just lost any chance of keeping his private life away from this terrible man. Graham stopped, processing the information. An amateur race, the one at the racetrack with a £5,000 prize for first place. Yeah, Joe confirmed, realizing Paul's mistake too late. And you need that money, don't you, Robert? Graham approached like a predator that had just scented blood. You need it desperately. Because of your sick daughter, I imagine. My secretary mentioned something about it. When she booked the service. Robert turned slowly, his eyes burning with fury. Leave my daughter out of this. Easy, easy. Graham held up his hands in a false surrender. I'm not being insensitive. In fact, I have a proposal, a very generous one. I don't want anything from you. Won't even hear it? Because it involves a lot more than £5,000. Graham smiled that cruel smile. I'm also entering that amateur race. I registered my Camaro yesterday. It'll be fun, I thought, and now it gets even more interesting. Mr. Davies frowned. Mr. Sterling, what are you getting at? I want to make a bet. Graham pointed to the Chevette and then to the Camaro. If Robert manages to beat me in the race with this tin can, I'll pay him £25,000. £25,000. More than enough for his daughter's treatment with change to spare. The silence in the garage was deafening. £25,000. It was more than Robert would earn in 3 years of work. It was enough to save Isabella, to give her the best possible chance. And if I lose, Robert heard himself ask, though he knew it was crazy to even consider. If you lose, you owe nothing. After all, it's pretty obvious you're going to lose. This is just to make things interesting. Graham extended his hand. So, do you accept, or has the great driver lost his nerve? Robert looked at the outstretched hand, then at Mr. Davies, Joe and Paul. They all looked shocked, but he saw hope in their eyes. Hope that maybe, just maybe, this was possible. Do we have witnesses? Robert asked. Mr. Davies, Joe and Paul saw and heard everything. Graham pointed to the three of them. "You're witnesses that I promised to pay 25,000 if he wins, right?" The three men nodded, still processing the surreal situation. "Then we have a deal," Graham said, his hand still extended. Robert took a deep breath. He thought of Isabella in the hospital, fighting for her life. He thought of the £20,000 she needed, of the time that was running out. He thought of the fear that had paralyzed him for 15 years, the trauma that had turned him from a champion driver into a resigned mechanic. And he shook Graham Sterling Jr.'s hand, sealing the most important bet of his life. As soon as Graham left the garage with his friends, Robert felt the weight of what he had just done. Mr. Davies pulled him into the office, closing the door behind them while Joe and Paul remained outside, still processing everything. "Robert, are you sure about this?" Mr. Davies took off his glasses and cleaned them nervously. "That man has a tuned V8 Camaro. You have a nearly 40-year-old Chevette." "I know what I have," Robert replied, but his voice betrayed his uncertainty. "And I know what's at stake." "Isabella," Mr. Davies sighed. "But what if you can't do it? What if the car doesn't hold up? What if I'm simply not capable anymore?" Robert finished, speaking the fear none of them wanted to verbalize. "It's possible, Mr. Davies. It's very possible I'll get in that car and discover I'm not who I used to be. But you're going to try anyway." "I have no choice. £25,000, Mr. Davies. It's more than I could save in years. It's the difference between giving my daughter a fighting chance or just waiting and hoping. And I'm not a man who just waits." Mr. Davies placed a hand on Robert's shoulder. "Then you'll have all the help you can get. Joe and Paul will help you prep the car. You can use the garage after hours, the tools, whatever you need. I'll cover the cost of any materials you're missing." Robert felt a lump in his throat. "Mr. Davies, I can't accept that. It's too much." "Just accept it." Mr. Davies put his glasses back on. "You've done a lot for this garage, Robert, and more importantly, you deserve this chance. Now go on, get back to work, because we still have jobs to do. But from Friday night, this place is yours." The next 3 days were a race against time. During the day, Robert worked as usual at the garage, doing maintenance, serving customers, keeping up appearances. But as soon as the workday ended, he transformed. The Chevette was brought into the workshop, and the real work began. On Friday night, with Joe and Paul by his side, Robert started stripping down the engine. Even though it was already tuned, he needed to check every component, ensure everything was perfect. There could be no room for error. A cracked piston, a poorly sealed gasket, a worn bearing, any small problem could mean the difference between victory and failure. "Mate, this engine is immaculate," Joe commented, examining the forged pistons. "You really know what you're doing." "I spent 12 years behind the wheel. You learn to know every bolt, every part. A driver who doesn't understand his car is a driver who doesn't win." Robert checked the valve clearances with surgical precision. Paul was working on the suspension, adjusting the ride height, swapping the springs and shocks for stiffer specs. "What about the weight difference? The Camaro must be twice the weight of this Chevette." "True," Robert agreed, "but it also has twice the power, maybe more. My only advantage will be in the corners. I'll have to win on agility, on driving skill, because on the straights he'll eat me alive." Joe stopped working and looked at Robert. "Can I ask a personal question?" Robert nodded without taking his eyes off his work. "The accident you had, was it really bad? Like, were you scared to drive afterwards?" Robert paused, the torque wrench motionless in his hand. "I was in the hospital for 8 months, Joe. 2nd and 3rd degree burns on 40% of my body, 15 surgeries, months of physiotherapy just to walk normally again, and yes, I was scared. A fear that doesn't go away, that's always there, waiting." "And now? Do you think you can do it?" "I have to." Robert went back to work. "It's not a matter of thinking, it's a matter of necessity." They worked until 3 in the morning that Friday. When they finally stopped, the engine had been completely overhauled, the suspension adjusted, the brakes fitted with new pads, and the cooling system reinforced. The Chevette wasn't pretty, but it was mechanically perfect. On Saturday, Robert went to the hospital in the morning. Isabella was better, with more color in her cheeks, more energy. The doctors had adjusted her medication, and she was responding well. "Dad, you look tired," she said, as soon as he entered the room. Worked late last night. Robert sat beside the bed. But everything's fine. How are you feeling? Better. Dr. Anna said if I keep this up, I could be discharged in 2 weeks. Of course, I'll have to come back for more chemo, but I'll get to sleep at home. Isabella smiled, and Robert felt his heart ache. That's great, sweetheart, really great news. And you, Dad? Isabella took his hand. Any news? You seem different. I can't explain it. But there's something different about you. Robert hesitated. Should he tell her about the race? About the bet? Part of him wanted to spare his daughter the pressure, but another part knew Isabella deserved the truth. Bella, I'm entering a race tomorrow. Isabella's eyes widened. A race? A real one? With the Chevette? With the Chevette, Robert confirmed. It's an amateur race, at the municipal racetrack. And there's prize money. Good prize money, that can help us. Isabella was silent for a moment, processing. And are you scared? I'm terrified, Robert admitted, surprising himself with his honesty. It's been 15 years since the last time I really pushed it, since the accident. I don't know if I can still do it, Bella. I don't know if I'm still that man. Isabella squeezed her father's hand with surprising strength. Dad, you want to know what I think? I think you never stopped being that man. You were just waiting for a good enough reason to come back. And now you have one. You're not scared for me that I'll get hurt? I am, she said simply. But I'm also scared every day here in this hospital. Scared of the illness, scared of the treatments, scared of not getting better. But if I let the fear win, I would have already given up. And I'm not giving up, Dad. So you can't either. Robert hugged his daughter, feeling tears stream down his face. When had this 12-year-old girl become so wise? When had she grown up so much? I'm going to win this race, Bella. I'll win it for you. No, Dad. Isabella pulled back from the hug and looked him in the eyes. Win it for you. Because you deserve it. Because you're a real driver and that's part of who you are. If you win the prize money, great. But even if you don't, you'll have already won just by having the courage to try. Robert spent the rest of the day at the hospital, talking with Isabella, reading to her, watching her sleep peacefully. When night fell, he returned to the garage. Joe and Paul were already there, making the final adjustments to the Chevette. Just the test run left, Paul said. We need to take it for a spin, see if everything's working. Let's head for the motorway, Joe suggested. That straight, empty stretch of the M62 at night. Robert nodded. The three of them got into the Chevette, with Robert at the wheel. The engine roared to life with a deep, powerful sound, very different from the gentle purr of a standard Chevette. Robert felt the vibration in the steering wheel, the pulse of the engine through the entire car. They drove to the motorway, finding an empty, well-lit stretch. Robert pulled over onto the hard shoulder, his hands on the wheel, breathing deeply. I just need to accelerate, he said to himself. Just accelerate and see if I can do it. Go for it, Joe encouraged from the back seat. No pressure, just a test. Robert pressed the accelerator slowly, feeling the car respond. 40, 50, 60 miles per hour. So far, so good. 70, 80. His heart began to race along with the car. 90, 100. His hands started to sweat. And then, at 110 miles per hour, it happened. The memory of the crash exploded in his mind like a flash of lightning. The flames, the pain, the absolute fear. Robert abruptly took his foot off the accelerator, almost slamming on the brakes. Easy, Rob, Paul said, his voice firm but gentle. Breathe. You're okay. We're all okay. Robert pulled the car over, his hands trembling on the wheel. I can't do it. I can't go past that. Every time I accelerate, I see the fire, I feel the heat. Joe put a hand on his shoulder. Mate, you're traumatized. It's normal. But tomorrow, when you're on the track, it'll be different. There will be adrenaline. There will be focus. The driver in you will take over. And if he doesn't, what? If I freeze in the middle of the race? Then you slow down and come back to the pits, Paul said. But at least you tried. And I believe that when the time comes, when you hear the engines of the other cars, when you feel the competition, something will wake up in you, something that's been dormant for 15 years. Robert took a deep breath, wiped the sweat from his face, and drove back to the city slowly. At home, he couldn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling, thinking about the race, about Isabella, about Graham and his mocking smile, about the Chevette waiting for him. At 5 in the morning on Sunday, he gave up trying to sleep. He took a shower, put on comfortable clothes, and pulled out the old racing suit he kept at the back of his wardrobe. It was yellowed with age, with the faded logos of old sponsors, but it still fit. When he arrived at the garage at 7, Joe and Paul were already there, having spent the night working on the final details. The Chevette was ready, gleaming under the garage lights, its engine whispering promises of power. "It's time," Joe said, tossing the keys to Robert. "Let's show that poser what a well-prepped Chevette and a real driver can do." The Manchester Municipal Racetrack was buzzing with activity when Robert arrived at 8:30 in the morning. Cars of all types filled the paddock, from serious custom builds to clearly amateur projects. There were about 15 entrants, each with their own story, each seeking the £5,000 prize, or simply the glory of winning. Robert's Chevette immediately drew attention, not for its beauty, certainly, but for the audacity of someone bringing such an old and seemingly simple car to compete. Some laughed. Others commented among themselves, but the more experienced ones noticed something in Robert's eyes, a determination that went beyond ordinary competition. Joe and Paul helped unload the equipment from the makeshift trailer: tools, spare tires, extra fluids, everything they might need. Mr. Davies had also shown up, bringing coffee and bacon sandwiches in a thermal bag. "Are you ready?" Mr. Davies asked, offering Robert a coffee. Robert held the styrofoam cup with hands that were already beginning to tremble. "I don't know, Mr. Davies, I honestly don't know." It was then that the unmistakable roar of a V8 announced the arrival of Graham Sterling Jr. The yellow Camaro entered the paddock like a predator, arriving in its hunting grounds. Graham got out of the car wearing a new expensive racing suit, clearly bought especially for the occasion. 2 professional mechanics accompanied him, carrying equipment that cost more than the entire Chevette. "Robert!" Graham shouted from a distance, waving exaggeratedly. "You actually came! I thought you might have reconsidered and stayed home, but no, here you are with your little tin can. This is going to be more fun than I imagined." Robert didn't respond. He was focused on checking the tire pressure, the fluid levels, every little detail that could make a difference. Joe and Paul formed a human barrier between him and Graham, preventing the Millionaire from getting too close. Qualifying began at 9:30. Each driver would have 3 laps to set their best time, and the starting positions would be based on those times. Robert waited until almost the end, watching the other competitors, analyzing their driving lines, studying the track he hadn't seen in so long. Graham's Camaro was the third to go out. The roar of the V8 echoed throughout the racetrack as he accelerated down the main straight. Robert saw on the timing screens that Graham was fast, very fast. He lacked refined technique, driving with brute force and excessive power, but the car was so superior that it compensated for his lack of skill. He set the 3rd fastest time of the session. Finally, it was Robert's turn. He put on his old helmet, adjusted the 4-point harness they had installed in the Chevette, and started the engine. The roar was different from the Camaro's, sharper, more urgent, like a smaller but equally dangerous animal. "Robert Smith in car number 17, the announcer declared. "And folks, I've just received some interesting information. That name was familiar to me, and I've found out why. Robert Smith was a professional driver in the British Touring Car Championship between 2000 and 2012, a 3-time champion. What on earth is he doing here in an amateur race?" The announcer's comment caused a stir in the crowd. Graham, who was drinking water in the paddock, spat it all out when he heard. A touring car champion. That miserable mechanic had been a champion. Robert entered the track and for a few seconds sat stationary in the pit, Lane, the engine rumbling, his hands gripping the wheel. The fear was there, palpable, real. He could feel sweat trickling down his back, his heart pounding. "Come on, Dad," he whispered to himself, remembering Isabella's words. For you, Bella. For you. He accelerated. The Chevette responded instantly, the engine screaming, the tires fighting for traction on the warm tarmac. First corner, he braked too early, losing time. Second corner, he entered too slowly. He was driving with fear, driving at the limit of his control but far from the limit of the car. And then, on the pit straight, something happened. The muscle memory, dormant for 15 years, began to awaken. His hands found the perfect spot on the wheel. His feet danced between the accelerator, brake and clutch with forgotten precision. On the third corner, he entered faster, feeling the limits of adhesion. Turn 3. The damn turn 3 where it had all ended. Robert saw it approaching, felt the panic trying to overwhelm him. But this time, he took a deep breath and put his foot down. The Chevette went through the corner perfectly, the rear end sliding slightly, but Robert correcting it with a millimeter-perfect countersteer. Something inside him broke at that moment. Not his nerve, but the chains that held him. He completed the lap with a mediocre time, 10th place, but on the second lap, it was different. Robert Smith, the driver, had woken up. He attacked every corner with surgical precision, braking at the last possible moment, accelerating on the exit with controlled aggression. The Chevette danced under his command, light and responsive. On the straight, despite the lack of raw power, he maintained a competitive top speed through perfect aerodynamic driving. When he crossed the line after the third lap, the time he registered put him in 10th. It wasn't ideal, but considering the car and his 15 years away, it was impressive. The race was scheduled to start at noon, with 20 laps planned. The 15 competitors lined up on the grid, Graham's Camaro in 3rd, Robert's Chevette in 10th. Between them were a tuned Golf, a Civic Type R, an old Mustang, and an eclectic mix of machines ranging from competent to ridiculous. In the car next to Robert, a young lad named Bruno smiled and shouted through his window, "I learned to drive watching your races on TV when I was a kid. It's an honor to be on the track with you." Robert waved, feeling something strange and good in his chest. Pride, perhaps. Or purpose. Or the simple feeling of being where he was supposed to be. The lights came on. Red. The silence before the storm. Every engine roaring in anticipation, every driver tense, ready. Robert held the wheel, his heart strangely calm now. The fear was gone. In its place, only absolute focus. Green. The start was chaotic, as always. Graham's Camaro used its brutal power to gain 3 positions in the first corner, taking the lead. Robert held his 10th position, avoiding the bumps and minor accidents that inevitably happen on the first lap. But from the second lap, Robert began his climb. He overtook the 9th-place car at Turn 2, a tuned VW Polo that simply didn't have the pace. On the next lap, he passed a Civic on the brakes into Turn 5, surprising the driver with his aggression. 8th place. Graham, up at the front, had a 5-second lead over 2nd place. He was driving erratically, but the car was so superior it made up for his mistakes. In his rearview mirror, he saw the moss-green Chevette advancing through the pack and laughed. No matter how hard the old mechanic tried, he would never catch the Camaro. By the 5th lap, Robert was in 6th. He had overtaken 2 cars in the same lap, one on the outside of Turn 3 using a line no one else dared to try, another on the inside under braking for Turn 7. The crowd started paying attention to that old Chevette that was being driven as if it weighed half as much. By the 7th lap, 5th place. By the 9th, 4th, after a spectacular overtake on the Mustang down the pit straight, Robert using the slipstream to compensate for the power difference. Graham got the message over the radio that the Chevette was in 4th and closing fast. He pushed even harder, forcing the Camaro beyond what was necessary, breaking all the rules of equipment preservation. It didn't matter if the car would last. He had to win, had to humiliate that arrogant mechanic who dared to challenge him. It was on the 10th lap that disaster struck Robert. White smoke began to pour from the Chevette's bonnet. The engine temperature shot up, the needle entering the red zone. A loss of power, a dramatic loss. The engine was overheating, probably a failure in the cooling system caused by the stress of the race. Robert fell from 4th to 6th, then to 8th, then to 10th. Drivers he had easily overtaken were now passing him back. Graham, informed of the situation, deliberately slowed down as he lapped Robert, honking his horn and making gestures out the window. Joe shouted over the radio, desperate. "Rob, you have to pit. You're going to blow the engine." "5 more laps," Robert replied, his voice far too calm. "Just 5 more laps. What's losing an engine compared to losing a daughter?" Robert ignored the protests over the radio and floored the accelerator despite the smoke, despite the needle in the red, despite everything. Something had changed in him at that moment. It was no longer about the bet, no longer about the money. It was about proving to himself that he was still Robert Smith, the driver, the champion, the man who never gave up. The 11th lap was agony. The engine coughed, lost power on the straights, but in the corners, Robert compensated with pure driving skill. He regained a position, then another. His instincts, dormant for 15 years, were now fully awake, guiding his every move, every braking point, every corner exit. On the 12th lap, the impossible happened. A collision between the 2nd and 3rd place cars at turn 4 sent them both spinning off the track. No one was hurt, but both were out of the race. Robert, who had been desperately fighting for 8th place, suddenly found himself in 6th. Graham saw in his rearview mirror that the Chevette was still in the fight, still coming, stubborn as a weed that refused to die. He pushed the Camaro's accelerator even harder, hearing the V8 engine roar in response. He had a nearly 10-second lead over 2nd place now, a red Golf GTI driven by a competent competitor. By the 13th lap, Robert was in 5th. By the 14th, in 4th. The Chevette's engine was dying, the oil pressure dropping dangerously, but it still responded when he demanded it. It was as if the car understood what was at stake, as if it too were fighting for Isabella. 15th lap. Robert overtook the 3rd place car at the pit entry, a risky maneuver that made the crowd roar. 3rd place now, but a long way behind the 2nd place Golf GTI. And Graham was way out in front, untouchable, victory all but guaranteed. It was on the 16th lap that everything changed. Graham, so obsessed with maintaining his lead, so desperate to ensure Robert's humiliation, made a fatal error. He entered turn 7 too fast, hit the brakes mid-corner, and lost the rear. The Camaro spun beautifully, doing a full 360 before sliding off the track and stopping in the runoff area. The engine, pushed beyond its limits for 16 laps of total abuse, chose that moment to give up. Steam and black smoke poured from the Camaro's bonnet. Graham tried to restart it once, twice, 3 times. Nothing. The car was dead, defeated by its driver's arrogance. Robert passed the stationary Camaro on the 17th lap. He didn't honk, didn't make a gesture. He simply drove past, focused on the track ahead. He was in 2nd place now, with the leading Golf GTI just 3 seconds ahead. Joe screamed over the radio, incredulous. "You're in 2nd! Only 3 seconds off the leader! 3 seconds!" "How long to go?" Robert asked, his voice frighteningly calm. 3 laps. You've got 3 laps. The Chevette's engine was in its death throes. The temperature gauge was beyond the red zone, in territory that simply shouldn't exist. The oil pressure was at 0. Constant white smoke billowed from the bonnet. But the engine kept running, stubborn, refusing to quit. Robert began the hunt. On the 18th lap, he closed the gap to 2 seconds. The driver of the Golf looked in his rearview mirror and saw the Chevette approaching like a ghostly apparition amidst the smoke. He accelerated, defended his lines in the corners, driving defensively. But Robert Smith hadn't been a 3-time champion for nothing. He knew every trick, every strategy. On the 19th lap at turn 3, that cursed corner where it had all ended 15 years before, he made his move. He braked impossibly late, threw the car down the inside into a gap that barely existed, felt the slight touch between their sides, but he was through. 1st place. The crowd erupted. The announcer was screaming in disbelief. Joe and Paul were jumping and hugging in the paddock. Mr. Davies was wiping tears from his eyes. But the final lap was still to come, and the Chevette's engine was dying. Robert felt the power dropping with every second. The car that had responded instantly now hesitated, sputtered, begged for mercy. On the pit straight, the Golf GTI began to close in again, its healthy engine against the Chevette's agonizing one. "Come on, old girl," Robert murmured to the car, patting the steering wheel. "Just one more lap. Just this one." Turn 1, 2, 3. The Golf was glued to his rear bumper now. Turn 4, 5. Side by side on the back straight. Turn 6, 7, 8. The Golf ahead by half a car length. The final, straight. The two cars flat out, engine against engine, will against will. Robert's Chevette was smoking like an old steam train, the Golf driven with technical perfection. Meter by meter, centimeter by centimeter, they charged towards the finish line. The crowd was on its feet. The silence before the final result was deafening. Photo finish. The two cars crossed the line practically together, impossible to tell with the naked eye who had won. Robert took his foot off the accelerator, and the Chevette's engine died instantly, like a runner collapsing after crossing the marathon finish line. The car coasted to a stop in the deceleration zone. Robert took off his helmet with trembling hands, not from fear this time, but from pure adrenaline. He looked up at the sky, at the strong midday Manchester sun, and allowed himself to breathe. The loudspeaker crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have the result of the photo finish. The difference was just 47 thousandths of a second, and the winner is car number 17, Robert Smith, in the Chevette." Chaos. Absolute and complete chaos. Joe and Paul ran onto the track before the marshals even gave the all clear. Mr. Davies followed, slower but just as emotional. When they reached the Chevette, they found Robert still sitting, his hands on the wheel, tears streaming down his face. "You did it, mate. You did it." Joe pulled Robert out of the car and hugged him. "The engine," Robert mumbled. "I blew the engine, my dad's Chevette." "To hell with the engine," Paul shouted, laughing and crying at the same time. "We'll build another one. You just did the impossible." The podium ceremony was surreal. Robert stood on the top step, holding the first-place trophy and a symbolic check for £5,000. The second and third place finishers congratulated him with genuine respect. The crowd applauded, many having watched his professional races years ago, thrilled to see him win again. But the real test was yet to come. Graham Sterling Jr. was waiting in the paddock, next to his broken Camaro, his face a mask of humiliation and rage. His friends had vanished. The professional mechanics were busy trying to salvage something from the destroyed engine. He was alone for the first time in a long time. Robert approached, still in his sweaty racing suit, holding the £20,000 check. "Graham, about our bet." Graham looked away. "That was a joke, Robert. You didn't think I was serious, did you? Besides, there were no valid witnesses. They were all your friends." "Actually, there was," a voice said from behind them. They both turned. A man in his 60s, with grey hair and a military posture, was approaching. Robert recognized him immediately. Anderson Taylor, owner of the biggest racing team in the region, a former driver himself, a living legend of British motorsport. "Mr. Taylor," Graham turned pale, "I didn't know you were here. I was at your garage on Thursday, Graham, when you made the bet." Anderson looked at Robert with respect. "I brought my car in for a service and heard everything. £25,000 if the Chevette beat the Camaro. And it did. Decisively, I might add." But, Graham stammered, "it was just a bit of fun." "Fun?" Anderson crossed his arms. "Your father, Sterling Sr., has been a friend of mine for 30 years. He sponsors my team. How do you think he'll react when he finds out his son is welshing on bets, that he's not a man of his word? The Sterling family's reputation is at stake here." Graham looked like a child being scolded. "But I don't have 25,000 in cash on me right now." "Then transfer it." Anderson pointed to his phone. "Bank transfers exist for a reason. Or would you prefer I call your father now?" With trembling fingers, Graham took out his phone. "What are your bank details?" he asked Robert, his voice barely a whisper. Robert recited the numbers. Moments later, his phone pinged. A transfer notification. £25,000. He looked at the amount, incredulous. With the 5,000 from the prize, he had 30,000, more than enough to save Isabella. "Now get out of my sight," Graham said, his voice laced with venom. I hope I never see you or your ridiculous tin can ever again." "Actually," Anderson interrupted again, turning to Robert. "Mr. Smith, I watched you drive today. It was masterful. To compensate for a 40-50 horsepower disadvantage with pure technique. I haven't seen driving of that caliber in years. I'd like to offer you a job, a technical consultant for my team, help prepare the cars, train young drivers. The pay is 4 times what a neighborhood mechanic makes." Robert was speechless. "Mr. Taylor, I don't know what to—" Say yes," Anderson smiled. "British Motorsport lost a great driver when you stepped away. At least we can gain a great mentor. And look, about this Chevette's engine, my workshop can rebuild it. I have the parts, the expertise, no charge. Consider it a gift for reminding me why I love racing." That evening, Robert arrived at St. Monica's Hospital, with his heart overflowing. Isabella was awake, reading a book by the light of her bedside lamp. When she saw her father enter, her face lit up. "You raced today. How did it go?" Robert sat on the bed, took his daughter's hand. "I won, Bella. I won the race, and I beat my fear. And I got the money for your treatment, all the money you need." Isabella threw her arms around her father's neck, crying with relief and joy. Robert held her carefully, feeling the weight of 15 years of fear and pain finally dissolve. The next day, Monday, Robert arrived early at the garage. He found Graham waiting, alone, without the Camaro, without the arrogance. The millionaire was holding a thick envelope. "Here," he said simply, holding it out. "25,000 in cash. I preferred to bring it in person as well." Robert took the envelope, checked the money, counted every note. When he finished, he separated £5,000 and handed it back to Graham. "What's this?" Graham frowned. "This," Robert said firmly, "you are going to donate, anonymously, to the pediatric oncology ward at St. Monica's Hospital. And that's not all. You're going to make monthly donations for the next 2 years, £250 a month, as penance." "Penance?" Graham repeated, incredulous. "You humiliated people because you could, because you had money and thought it made you better. Now you're going to use that money to help children who are fighting for their lives, and you're going to do it without seeking recognition, without putting your name on a plaque. You'll do it because it's the right thing to do." Robert crossed his arms. "If I find out you haven't, I'll tell your father and Mr. Taylor about your dishonor. Understood?" Graham nodded, for the first time looking genuinely ashamed. "Understood. And one more thing," Robert pointed to the door. "Never come back to this garage. You're not welcome here. Find somewhere else to service your next car." Graham left without another word, carrying a weight that money couldn't buy or relieve. 3 months passed. Isabella had started the treatment with the imported drugs the week after the race. The response was immediate and dramatic. The doctors spoke of remission, of recovery, of a future. She was discharged from the hospital and was now receiving outpatient treatment, returning home every night. Robert split his time between St. George's Garage during the day and Anderson Taylor's team in the evenings and on weekends. The money was better. The satisfaction of being back in the world of racing was immeasurable. He had found his place again, not as a driver, but as a mentor, a technician, as someone who understood engines and tracks and the souls of those who loved speed. On a sunny Saturday in September, Joe and Paul asked Robert to come to the garage. They said they needed help with an urgent job, but when he arrived, he found something completely different. In the middle of the workshop, covered with a tarp, was the unmistakable shape of a car. Robert looked at his friends, confused. "We know you were sad about losing the original Chevette," Joe said, smiling. "Your dad's car, all those memories. So we, along with Mr. Taylor's team, chipped in and did this." Paul pulled off the tarp. Underneath, gleaming and perfect, was a 1989 Vauxhall Chevette. The same moss-green color as the original, but completely restored. The bodywork was dent-free, the paint brilliant, the interior new. And when Robert looked at the engine, he saw they had used all the salvageable parts from the old car, combined with new components. "It's not exactly the same," said Mr. Davies, who was also there, "but it's got your father's soul in it, and now it has yours, too." Robert couldn't speak. He just walked around the car, running his fingers over the cool bodywork, opening the door, sitting in the driver's seat. The smell of a new car mixed with the familiar feeling of the space, of the steering wheel under his hands. "There's a passenger waiting for a ride," Joe said. Isabella came out of Mr. Davies's office, wearing a yellow dress, her hair beginning to grow back, still short but there, real, proof of life and victory. She ran to the car and got into the passenger seat. "Well, Dad, are we going for a drive or not?" Robert started the engine. The deep, familiar rumble filled the garage. He pulled out slowly, Isabella by his side, and drove through the streets of the Hopewood district under the warm September sun. They passed her school, the park where she used to play, the places that formed the map of their lives. "Are you happy, Dad?" Isabella asked, the wind messing up her short hair. "I'm whole," Robert replied, smiling. "For the first time in 15 years, I'm whole. I have you, I have my work, I have this car, I have my identity back. And I'm okay," Isabella said, taking her father's hand. "I'm going to be okay." "I know, Bella, I know." They drove until sunset, father and daughter, connected by love and struggle, and that impossible victory that had saved not just Isabella's life, but Robert's soul. The moss-green Chevette cut through the streets quietly, carrying with it a story of redemption, of rediscovered courage, and of a father who had faced his greatest fears for the person he loved most in the world. And as the sun disappeared over the Manchester horizon, Robert Smith, mechanic, ex-driver, father, hero, finally felt at peace. The past had been honored, the present was secure, and the future shone with infinite possibilities.